Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Winograd. I'm joined here by Benj Giffone, and you're watching or listening to the LCI Green Room. Happy to be with you guys here tonight. This is, of course, our live show here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, and I'm one of our podcast hosts here at the Christians for Liberty Network. And joining me, as I already said, is Benj Giffone. He is the author of this book, which was published last year through LCI, which hopefully you guys can see that well. A House Divided: Technology, Worship, and Healing the Church After COVID. I can't recommend this book enough. And this is the kind of book that if you get it in the hands of your friends, your family, your pastor, even elders at your church, I think it is. This isn't like there's parts of the book that I think are a little bit punchy, but this isn't like a cage stage libertarian book, or it's not like handing someone from your church Anatomy of the State or anything like that. But there's the libertarianism is in there, but I think it's something that it's ecumenical in a way that it can be read by anyone, and even someone. Listen, if you know people on the left or someone who was pro the COVID regime, I think they'd be able to at least read this book, and you can have a hopefully productive conversation from it. But tonight we're here to talk about something far less controversial than the COVID regime, and that is the subject of immigration as it pertains to us here in America and as Christians, and how we navigate the tensions between the scripture tells us to treat the foreigner well, to love our neighbor, to love our enemy. And then, of course, also there are concerns that people have about mass migration, about bringing people in from cultures that maybe don't. The way I usually frame this is that we don't value God and liberty enough here in our own country, but yet we're still better than a lot of other places in the world. So there are some concerns about the consequences of not just open migration, but perhaps even state-funded, NGO-planned mass migration. So how do we navigate this tension? And that's something that I've been talking about a lot. I know Benj has been thinking about a lot and wants to talk about. So we're happy to get into it. Benj, how are you doing tonight? Thanks for being here.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. Thank you for accepting my invitation.
Yes,
to come on the
all
podcast.
All of our authors have an open, invite to invite themselves onto the green room. It actually makes my job easier because I don't have to think of a last minute. I'm usually scrambling. About the time you reached out to me is when I'm usually scrambling to think of, like, if I haven't already, I need to get a guest for the Monday night live stream. So this worked out very well.
Well, then maybe next time I can share with you some of my Star Wars fan fiction. We can work on that together. And
we'll get Scott Horton on for that one, and we'll have a Star Wars roundtable. Yeah,
great. But we better set aside about 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah, they'll have to start that one minimum, a little bit earlier.
Minimum, yeah. No, thanks so much for inviting me on. It's pretty cold here in Western Pennsylvania, where we've inundated with snow as most of the country, and nice to be in my office here, and thanks for letting me suggest this topic. One of the reasons why I was thinking about how to start into this subject, and I remembered when I was politically coming of age. I was raised in a religiously and politically conservative home in northern New Jersey, in the New York radio market. And so when I began listening to talk radio when I was maybe 13 or 14, which my parents weren't terribly happy about, but they just felt like, well, at least he's not listening to, gangster rap or something. But anyway, but there were a couple of very high profile cases of police misconduct among the New York police around that time, and a couple of them involving immigrants. The one that comes to mind was the shooting of, I believe his name was Amadou Diallo, and he was from West Africa, and he had been the story, I believe, was that he had been reaching for a gun or reaching for his wallet, but the police thought he was reaching for a gun, and they shot him 40 times, and then they found out he had no gun. And so then course, conservatives were backing the police and progressives were backing the immigrant. And so this was sort of my one of my formative moments in my early political consciousness. And then, though, as I grew up and came to identify more as libertarian and see the benefits of, or what libertarians and economists point to as the benefits of immigration, started to see things a bit differently, and then also had the experience, which maybe we can talk about in a little bit, of living in another country, living in Eastern Europe. We lived in Lithuania for 6 years, including through some of the COVID times, including the start of COVID. So if you want to read about what it was like to live in a former Soviet country during COVID, then you can, check out A House Divided. But living as an immigrant, but admittedly a high status immigrant, because I was teaching in a university and had a lot of help from the university with not really assimilating, but integrating and living our life there, but also observing the way that waves of refugees, first from the Middle East, came into Europe and specifically into Lithuania as they took their share of Middle Eastern immigrants, and then the way that Ukrainians were welcomed as refugees in 2022 in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. So a lot of kind of experiences there that definitely changed my perspective, thinking, living in an international context and living as a foreigner in someone else's country.
Yeah, I don't have quite the same experience. I think I've always been within our own borders here in America, but there's certainly. I mean, so my dad was a missionary. He did missionary work in Africa, and the church I go to has always been a very missions focused church. And I remember from like an early age just hearing stories. This was before I was even like politically aware, and just even hearing stories back then about the ways in which governments not only interfered with just travel, but even interfered with like missionary work, and how like there countries where there's people starving, and some of this is sometimes because they have enough food there, but their governments take their food and ship it out, and they don't, and kind of keep their people on very low rations. And then if you try to come in there as a a church or a ministry to provide some kind of relief, the government can interfere there. And the one story I heard, which I'm sure this has happened many times, is like they would demand essentially what were like extortions and bribes, to basically be like, you can't dock your boat with this, or you can dock your boat, but you can't bring the supplies unless you pay pay these fees. And they were like just extraordinarily high, extravagant fees, and oftentimes not things that people could easily cough up and pay. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot that goes into the discussion of immigration. I've been and COVID relates to this, right? Like your book and what you talked about, like these are not completely disconnected things, because in the lead up to Trump's reelection, libertarians were, as they're always doing, debating each other and talking a lot about immigration. And I'm very understanding of the libertarians who are not for open borders. You have Rothbard, you have Hoppe, Lou Rockwell, Tom Woods, a fair number of people who were in like the Mises Institute, Ron Paul wing of the liberty movement. Even people like Milton Friedman. And I kind of understand where their arguments are coming from. And yet I was always sort of relating it back to COVID and saying, even if I understand these concerns, isn't this sort of like out of sync with our position on COVID, where like in one hand we said the government doesn't have a right to tell people they can't leave the country or they can't leave their state, to halt travel and to kind of decide who is essential and who isn't, and yet giving government control over immigration seems to be kind of ceding a lot of the same territory. Mm-hmm. And also the concerns about enforcement in terms of what it took in the places where it was enforced for COVID lockdowns and vaccine mandates to even attempt to be enforced. it's sort of like, well, that would require a massive police state and calls for more surveillance, calls for even less choice and freedom and autonomy over yourself. And that seems to be the same risk that comes with trying to do mass deportations and a mass enforcement of the border. Um, so obviously, the libertarian angle for this is complicated, but then I think it is also, as Christians, because the Libertarian Christian Institute, we should also stop and try to understand what Scripture teaches. And um, I'm curious to get your. I've read some of the things you've written on this, and we've talked a little bit about this beforehand. I am curious to get your take on what Scripture says regarding immigration, foreigners. There's obviously a lot of motifs in the Bible about like being in exile, living in a foreign land. The Jews and Israel did that at one point. That's likened to us as sort of the new covenant community within Christ. There's obviously passages that people throw around saying that like treat the foreigner well, the traveler well, and things like that. But then there's also obviously like in at least Old Testament theocratic Israel, there were these somewhat strict rules, at least regarding mixture of like the cultures and things like that, and uh, even somewhat regarding trade and whatnot. And so I guess there are some things that people from the more immigration restrictionist camp can try to point to. What is your sense in terms of just what you know of what all of Scripture says about the subject of like sort of the if you're marking territory of like if there's things on both ends, how do you start unpacking that?
Yeah, it's very tricky and obviously very complicated, but we can solve it all in just one conversation here this evening. But one of the things that is challenging is because the Bible does seem to say there you can prove text on both sides. You can prove text passages like in the law in Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy and Leviticus all have something to the effect of you must not oppress the foreigner for you because you were foreigners, you were strangers in Egypt, which is kind of a nice way of saying that you were enslaved in Egypt,
Right.
but you were foreigners, and so you should know what it's like, and so foreigners should be welcomed and not oppressed and not enslaved in Israel. On the other hand, you do have laws that it's not as though immigrants to Israel could come and practice their religion as they would have wished to if it involved things like ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. Those things would absolutely be forbidden in Israel. Or other kinds of there are things that they have to actually obey the laws of the place that they're living in. We also I think there's just sort of a disconnect, or it's very difficult to apply modern categories of borders. And in my own thinking and reading about this, of when we read in the Old Testament and see that let's say if it says something about Solomon having his territory extended all the way north and east to the Euphrates, well, maybe they weren't thinking in terms of like lines on a map. It probably means that there were some settlements northeast on the Euphrates that paid tribute to Solomon, but there wasn't like a line, a bird's eye view map that they were conceiving of that had borders of this is Israel and this is not. Really, it's where were people, where was land that they controlled for farming, where were settlements. And then in terms of the question of intermixture, right, or mixed marriages and things like that, the issue seems to be in many cases not so much race or ethnicity as we conceive of it in the modern age. It's really more about culture and religion and also language to some degree. And so I think that translating either commands in the Old Testament to welcome foreigners without any qualification, or commands not to integrate yourself with foreigners, have to be seen both in terms of in light of the new covenant, in light of what is stated about who are the people of God in the New Covenant, which is prefigured in the Old Testament, in the passages in Isaiah and the prophets that have the inclusion of Gentiles. But also we have to translate those principles from the Old and New Testaments together into a modern situation with borders and with a welfare state that, for most, like we can't really understate how much more prosperous we are in modern times, and how what we can, in some sense, offer not just the poor of our own people, but also help for immigrants, is so much more than what could possibly have been offered in ancient Israel, where, if you wanted to come from Moab, as say Ruth did with Naomi, you could come, but if you didn't have any land on which to grow food, if you didn't marry into an Israelite family, then all you could do is glean from the corners of the field, which is basically subsistence, but probably less than subsistence, because most people were doing subsistence farming anyway on the land that they owned. So whereas today, many of the issues that people have with immigration and concerns we have about immigration are that foreigners will come and live off of the welfare state, or take advantage of, or just not know how to integrate well into the many ways that government has forced us to be connected to one another, right? So
Right.
I think you mentioned Milton Friedman before, but he's the one I always associate with the idea that open borders and a welfare state are not compatible with one another.
Yep, that he's famous for that. One thing you said, which I want to parse out a little bit more, because I guess I agree in a sense, but I guess this might be a matter of application, was in the Old Testament, the laws regarding mixture being more about, sort of culture and sort of the maintaining. They weren't strictly about ethnic differences, and of course, there's kind of like using modern terms and categories, and they don't always map on one to one. But certainly, it seems, at least by the time we get to uh, Jesus, and probably before that, perhaps unintentionally, a consequence of some of those laws did create some, I guess, ethnic rivalry or uh, discontentment between the Jewish people and the Gentiles. And then, of course, there's the complicated history of the Jewish people and the Samaritans. And again, it's not quite accurate to say they related to each other like in their worst elements, that it's the same as, like, imagining a, go back in American history and imagining a white Southerner talking to like a freed slave. Like I'm not quite saying it's the same sort of ethnic prejudice and tension, but it's certainly, I guess, within the same subtype of sort of developed uh, prejudice. Like people, and I think people just do this today too, is they will start to conflate different things, right? Like they'll conflate what might be at root a cultural problem with a particular uh, people group that have a certain common, uh, you know, ethnic background of sorts. So, I mean, is that fair to say, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly that is a human tendency. I think it's a very natural human tendency, but I do think that even before the New Testament states pretty clearly, first through Jesus's interactions with Samaritans and Gentiles, and then Paul saying that he is not a Jew who is one outwardly by circumcision of the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly by circumcision of the heart.
Yeah,
which
Romans
is
2.
which is
Yeah.
Old Testament language as well. But even in the Old Testament, there's commands against intermarrying with Moabites and Ammonites and Egyptians and Edomites, and commands to kill all the Canaanites. But then the first thing the Israelites do when they go into the land is they make a covenant with Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute. But and that's not something that's looked on as a negative in the story. It's a positive, and she joins the people of Israel because she professes and has genuine faith in the God of Israel. And so anything that we read in the Pentateuch that speaks about exclusion of these other people groups it is really about excluding their pagan beliefs and practices. And even in Leviticus, it says that if the Israelites adopt the pagan practices of the nations that they're going in to dispossess, then the land will vomit the Israelites out, even as the land is being cleared of these Canaanites for Israel to live in it.
Yeah.
So the issue was never really the ethnicity of people like Rahab or Ruth the Moabite or Uriah the Hittite or even Caleb, the leader of the Judahites. He's a Kenizzite, according to Numbers 32. So he's even someone who's intermarried into Israel or come to just identify with Israel, but he believes strongly in the God of Israel, and that's what counts. So,
Right.
so even though by the time of the New Testament we do have this very clear, I think it's built into who we are as humans to kind of start to identify tribally. Although our identity, I'd say identity is we understand that it's a very flexible and malleable and fluid concept, because we identify with the people around us. But does that mean people in our town? Does it mean people who are of our same religion? Does it mean people who are libertarians like us? I feel you and I have never met in person, but I know that there's things that if we got together, we would just totally click on, because we're from a similar subculture of a subculture. We're Christian
Right.
libertarians, right? So I would identify, I think, more closely. We would identify more closely with one another than with the person who has I don't know, than someone down the street who has just very standard progressive views on most things. So I think that there's a lot there, but
Yeah, no, I mean, this is like we're both reformed, and
mm-hmm.
Romans 9 is another famous passage, which at least in part touches on this, because Paul says it's not all who are of Israel and all who are descendants of the physical lineage of Israel who are Israel, meaning that kind of hearkening that same idea from Romans 2, that it's always been uh, a covenant of faith, not a covenant of works or of just like, I'm saved or I'm counted as special just because of my bloodline alone. That there's something deeper at play there. But I guess there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so people maybe slightly different ways, but still kind of the same archetype is playing out today. And I often, I said there are some in the border restrictionist camp who I can relate to, but then there are others who take it more than a step too far, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And they literally, I think, in what I would say is in clear contradiction to scripture, say that they have more in common with atheists and secular people who are of the same race and like, I guess, like American culture and heritage or European heritage than they do with a Christian living in, say, Pakistan or India or China or from Mexico or something. Which and that's not to say that. I guess it just depends on what frame of analysis. Like, there are some things you have more in common with the secular atheist progressive born here in America, but are what should we weigh more, I wonder. And I've interacted, and I know you more, even more so than I have. I've interacted with people of the faith from different ethnicities, different nations of origin, different backgrounds, and that is such a unique element of the Christian experience, is to find people who have these different walks of life from this earthly perspective, and yet instantly find that kinship and that brotherly and sisterly relationship with fellow Christians from all walks of life all across the earth. And so that's something that I feel like even as we consider uh, questions of what's best policy, questions of weighing different principles and figuring out how to resolve tensions that might arise. I think people who are approaching this with the premise that uh, you know, again, I think in contradiction to Romans 9, in contradiction to Galatians 3 and 4, you bring up a good example in Rahab in the Old Testament. It's like we should always be elevating that, uh, that shared Christian identity and experience that transcends nationality and culture. Um, and I'm especially aggrieved whether it's war, whether it's immigration, whether it's economics, when state policy is causing harm to Christians even outside of my own country. I'm grieved by that. I think that's something that we as Christians should like if something benefits America but comes at the cost of Christians in another country, I don't know that we can, you know, cheer that on necessarily.
Yeah.
I think that should be troubling.
Yeah. I think we don't always understand or appreciate the degree to which Christianity has liberated us, and to whatever extent Western culture is influenced by Christianity, from tribalism and how bad tribalism really is. And I preached about this recently, but so when Jesus says I'm working through a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of eclectically through, more topical studies through ideas from the Sermon on the Mount. But I've always not puzzled, but just been fascinated when Jesus says at the end of chapter 5, where he says, you have heard it said to you, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, which of course, hate your enemy is not technically in the Old Testament, but there are some passages that speak about hating enemies, at least the enemies of God. But then Jesus says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then for what good is it? Let me just get the exact quotation here so I don't butcher God's word. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And Jesus is not saying there that it's a bad thing for the Gentiles, for the nations of the world, for us to love our brothers, our clan, our people who are close to us, because that's really. He does say love your father, honor your father and mother. You're supposed to love your spouse above all other people in the world. You're supposed to take care of your children, or else you're worse than an unbeliever, is what Paul says in 1 Timothy, right? And so he places us in human families and human societies, and those shape who we are, and we care for one another best. Those who are best positioned to care for each of us are those who are closest to us, right? However, if the ethic of Christianity and what Christ calls us to, which is, I will always say, to avoid being a Marcionite, it's always prefigured in the Old Testament as well,
Right.
but that we shouldn't stop there. We can't just stop there and say that we're going to love those who are members of our tribe. We have to love our enemies. We love those who are not members of our tribe. And what Christianity has been able to do, building on the foundation of the Old Testament, is this idea that all human beings share a common descent and are made in the image of God. The Israelites were very unusual in the ancient world in that their book that tells about the origin of humanity says that basically all people are, even the Babylonians, even the Egyptians, even the Canaanites, are all descended from the same human pair. And actually, the Israelites are kind of latecomers. They're not as ancient as peoples like the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Babylonians. And so, whereas other cultures thought of themselves as either being the special creation of their God, and so they were inherently better than everyone else, or that different nations were created by different gods. So this is a revolutionary idea that all human beings are made in the image of the one God. And so all bear his image and are worthy of respect and love in some fashion. So this is, and I think if we don't appreciate how even our idea, you mentioned before, corruption in different countries where people are prevented from, let's say missionaries or humanitarian aid is prevented from going in unless you pay a bribe of some kind. I actually have a story about this because when the Ukraine war, or when Russia invaded Ukraine the second time in 2022, our church in Lithuania put together a bunch of supplies. We drove in 2 vans, me, the other pastor, and some of the other folks from our churches in Lithuania, drove down to the border between Hungary and Ukraine. And we were going to bring those supplies into the country. And then our church partners in Western Ukraine who couldn't leave the country were then going to take the supplies further into Ukraine. So I was in Ukraine during the war for less than 24 hours, but I have a stamp on my passport from Ukraine. I'd been there before as well. But at the border, we ended up having to pay a thank you to the Ukrainian border guard, not the Hungarian guard, but the Ukrainian customs guard, except, just delayed on our paperwork for hours and hours until we offered him a thank you. And I don't feel too bad about it because it was diapers and formula for his child. So, but to take supplies into his country, he required a bribe we had to pay him a bribe for this. But this is just standard in many parts of the world, that if you have a position of government authority or power, then it's expected that you're going to use it for your personal benefit and the benefit of your family. And this is what Jesus is talking about when he says, don't even the tax collectors do the same. The tax collectors had the power of the state behind them, and they didn't make a salary. They could just take on top of whatever the Romans required, and that was their cut, right? So this sense that we have an obligation to a law that transcends just what's good for me and my family or my town or my tribe is a Christian idea. And it comes before the Enlightenment. And I think that we're in danger as Western society becomes less and less Christian. We tend towards more and more tribalism, and we don't realize we don't fully appreciate how bad things could get if we abandon this
right. Yeah.
greater good and principles that apply to all people, whether we call it human rights, principles that apply everywhere and to all people. If we lose that and in favor of tribalism, we're not going to like where that.
I wholeheartedly agree. If I were to bring something up that I think is an attempt to steel man the border restriction aside, it's that they would largely agree with you that Christian values have shaped the West and sort of made us to a large extent, not perfectly, but better than pretty much any other culture or nation in history, to rise above tribalism, especially the worst forms of tribalism. And yet there are parts of the world that still operate that way. And that our culture, which we can recognize is a mixed bag, that has many contradictory elements within it, but that still there are positive elements within our culture that are worth preserving and promoting and trying to make better, and that too many people from other parts of the world with a culture that's even worse could make that project of not just preserving Western culture, but trying to, ever increasingly reconcile it to, live in more consistent application with its founding creeds and values. We're going to make that a harder battle, or perhaps, we're going to lose our culture entirely if we allow it to be overrun by uh, immigrants from other parts of the world that don't share those values. And I do have to say that of all the arguments I've heard on the border restrictionist side, because I've heard the economic ones, whether that's about the open borders and welfare, whether that's about people being concerned about jobs being taken, crime, all these things I think have less merit. I think they have more merit when tied to this kind of like central argument, because I think it's sort of like the main, even like think about the open borders thing, right? Your real concern is that the welfare state and other things create the environment where people are not going to be integrated and assimilate into our culture, but that then they can sort of live, subsidized within the border of the American government and maintain their unique cultural identity, but also their values and promulgate those. I even know that there are those who are concerned that the Muslim world contains within it, uh, you know, individuals and groups of people who are intentionally trying to take advantage of this sort of like Western kindness and weakness, and that they intentionally, in ways similar to what they did in Europe, they want to come here and uh, instill their own values. Now, I'm very wary of that argument because it's very hard to. This is a bit of an aside, but I think it's important to draw it out a little bit. It's very hard to distinguish truth from propaganda when it comes to what's going on with the entirety of the Islamic world, not not only the ones that are immigrating to Europe and America. There are definitely problems, and then there's also a lot of like fear mongering and clickbait stuff that exists out there on social media and whatnot. So in uh, anyway, there's a complicated like our podcast there and just evaluating the West's relationship to Islam and to the Islamic world. But uh, what do you think to the broader concerns of just about our culture is superior, and yet if we don't safeguard it, it'll perish?
Hmm. Yeah, this is, I think, what I've heard Brian Kaplan refer to this as sort of like the killing the goose that lays the golden eggs um, argument. And, the goose, of course, that lays the golden eggs being Western liberalism, broadly understood, capitalism, prosperity. I think that there is something to it. I think where I've become more, where I think I see a little bit through it is that we have had, okay, so certainly the issues that are faced in Europe by sort of the integration project of Europe, where they try to integrate different countries and countries economically and promote exchange of students, and people can travel freely within Europe. That was an attempt to make sure that European countries never go to war again. And it is hard to imagine Germany and France being, ever going to war. Germany, France, and England ever going to war again. So that's been largely successful in a continent where the worldview and the values have been shaped by Christianity, and so the collision of Islam into Europe is a different matter than what has happened historically in the United States, where we have had mostly South and Central Americans who have typically a Roman Catholic heritage, or Asian immigrants who have maybe values, especially family values, that are at least similar to, or even sometimes even more conservative, socially conservative than many Americans of European descent. So I think there is something to this question of which immigrants are we bringing in. Where I find it a little bit, that rings a little bit hollow, though, is that I don't think we do such a great job in the United States of promoting those values, and if we did, if we had a more, let's just say, broadly speaking, a more libertarian. Most people in the United States are not libertarian. Maybe we have sort of a libertarian streak, or maybe more libertarian than other parts of the world, more liberty minded, freedom minded. But I don't think your average American is really that thinking in terms of like, well, we really have our constitutional norms and our values. I mean, there's sort of like this sort of bundle of myths that we learned in school about our founding and what we're here to do, but I don't think that plays a very significant role for most people in their everyday lives. And you can see this based on how they vote and sort of many of the choices that we make. And so when our culture was strong, if we look back to a time when maybe the government was not as much of an intrusion in our lives, and our culture was stronger, where people were forced to sort of stand on these freedom values more, I think actually we were better able to integrate and assimilate people from other cultures who didn't, because we had lots of European people immigrating from statist countries in the late 19th and first part of the 20th century, and they eventually integrated. But I think that as our culture actually is weaker than it has been in all those ways that you described, then we become more anxious, and it's easy for us to blame immigrants for pointing out the flaws or the weaknesses in our culture. It's easy to blame the Somalis in Minnesota, and I'm not defending those things that certain people of Somali background or immigration have done, but there's plenty of Medicare and Medicaid fraud, plenty of welfare fraud all over the country. And it was this particular, conflict that led, I think, it was very, very noteworthy in the news because it related to immigrants, that has caused these most recent ICE crackdowns and predictable clashes. And whereas if we really were concerned with strengthening our culture and rooting out fraud and maybe limiting the welfare state, then we wouldn't have so much resistance, or we wouldn't have as much of a problem integrating immigrants into our culture. I don't know. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. I have an analogy, which is not perfect, and no analogy is, but to me, it's kind of like going to like an elder and saying, well, I can't let my wife go to work because she's going to flirt with men at her workplace and be less faithful to me because she's dissatisfied in our marriage because I haven't taken her out on a date in a long time and I don't pay attention to her needs. And I'm also like, I'm watching pornography. And so it's like, imagine like, you are not protecting your marriage, not loving your wife, and then trying to control her when, maybe she is, because of the weakness of the marriage, being tempted in certain ways. But then the response needs to be to restore the marriage, not to enact a unfounded right to control your spouse's actions in that way. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, is that we're dealing with the sort of fallout of kind of what, ironically, some conservatives and what people call themselves Christian nationalists are wanting to go back to, which is this sort of like not a real Christian nation, not a nation that's like Christian from the ground up, but rather one that seeks to sort of reclaim this sort of nominal Christianity, almost, that's enforced on the public square, but that it's it might be a nationwide, but it's only it's only an inch deep. It's not penetrating into the hearts of people, and that. So yeah, like if you don't do a good job at doing the main things as the American church, and the culture, to just say it bluntly, goes to crap as a direct consequence of that, it's easy to blame other people. It's harder to blame yourself and say, this is my fault. I need to correct this. I got to correct it the right way. Taking shortcuts to correct a problem aren't going to fix it. And, using beyond just what we can talk about in a minute, which is like, you and I would agree with a certain outlook on what is the correct role for the civil magistrate to play in a society. And we would say that, uh, oh, there might be limited overlap with some immigration concerns, but overstepping kind of a strict view of law being tied to aggression is going to, it's going to be unbiblical. It's going to be uh, uh, an improper use of that force. But it's also just in a strict looking at, just from a policy level, from a consequential level, uh, that's a bad solution. It's a bad state solution to uh, I wouldn't say it's a state created problem, but it's sort of been a state fueled problem, right? Like culture
Yeah.
has degraded, and then state uh, operating in a flawed culture has then maybe come alongside a degrading culture and accelerated that decline. I'll end on this. There was something ironic. I had interaction earlier today in a private group chat, and the person was telling me, because I had shared I was doing this live stream, and they were like, "Well, we don't care about immigration anymore. The thing that matters," what they said. I'm not going to dox anyone. I'll just read his response. He was like, uh, he said, "We moved on from immigration. ICE is based, and I hope they 1,000 times their efforts. But the bigger issue is the thousands of satanic pedophiles who are running the country and controlling every media apparatus with more than 10 viewers." And I was like, so wait, you think the country is run by satanic pedophiles, and you think it was a good idea to put the satanic pedophiles in charge of who can be in the country and who can't be? I was like, because that's just like, again, I think that's the problem, is the more we outsource these problems and we want the solutions to be coming from government, you're going to reap what you sow there.
Right. No, certainly. But well, I do, even as we've sort of like, essentially we've been for the last few minutes critical of the maybe what would be the more right wing position or the conservative position. I will say that so much of what we experience with immigration, conflict, and lack of integration in this country is a government created program, and that can be laid at the feet of a certain kind of, I want to choose my words carefully here. I'm struggling to find the word, but because in a sense I identify with, personally being having a high tolerance I have very, very tolerance for other cultures. I love learning about other cultures. I've lived abroad. I'm a globalist in some sense, right? but there's a globalist ideology that sort of says that, when you hear slogans like "no person is illegal" or that everyone should be able to come in and claim asylum, the reason why we have these conflicts is because I think there's a broken system that neither party wants to solve, and then there are people who I think do believe that not just that anyone should be able to, that we should have more immigrants for economic reasons, but just sort of in principle, it's good for cultural distinctives to be weakened and culture to be undermined. And so this is where, and I do think for political reasons, there is evidence that government, previous administration was encouraging more and more immigration, and then would have people come and claim asylum with a very flimsy, non-adjudicatable, whatever, if that's even a word, make a claim, and then essentially be allowed to stay indefinitely until we can adjudicate their asylum claim. Now, I'm supportive of people seeking asylum, but most people who are coming to the United States are not seeking asylum in the strictest definition of the UN Convention on Refugees and Asylum, right? So they are we have a broken system that doesn't allow people to come here and specify what exactly their rights and responsibilities are if they're an economic migrant. And then we have sort of ideological actors trying to kind of push them into a society in ways that trample on and are not respecting of the rights of people who are here.
Yeah.
Like when I was just to kind of compare, maybe it helps put this in perspective. When I was an immigrant, again, a high status foreign national in Lithuania, a poorer country, I came from the United States. I was teaching at a university, so I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but I learned what my rights were and weren't. I sacrificed certain rights to privacy because there's lots of surveillance cameras everywhere in Europe. I had to register my car. I didn't import a car, but I bought a car, and I had to know, do I have the right to buy a car? Do I have to get a different driver's license? I had to learn how traffic laws are enforced. I had to pay taxes on the income I earned, and that high taxation went into their social welfare system that paid for our healthcare. And because my wife wasn't working, we had to pay additional for her for insurance, which wasn't that expensive, but she wasn't covered under the system, so we had to buy insurance for her. And so these are all, and I knew that if I didn't follow these rules, and even during COVID when I was there, and maybe if I were in America, I would have had more of a leg to stand on in disobeying some of the rules that I felt were unjust because it's my right as an American. Well, my right as an American doesn't entitle me to anything in Lithuania other than that I get deported to America if I disobey the rules.
Right.
So I think other countries, Lithuania doesn't have as big a problem with people coming illegally for economic reasons. They had a wave of immigrants that the European Union accepted in the wake of the Middle Eastern crisis. Those immigrants did not find a very welcome reception in Lithuania. They all then disappeared at one point, and the speculation was that they burned their documents and drove to Germany and filed for asylum again, because basically let's roll the dice again, because we lost the bet. We lost the first time. We ended up in Lithuania, although we did have some people from the Middle East who were part of our church in Klaipeda who were involved there. But
I feel like a lot of this is sort of also like when you're comparing the American government to a lot of these European countries and Eastern and Western ones and their sort of policies, like, because not, even though we're libertarians and we're generally anti-state, not all states are created equal, and a Lithuania having a immigration policy is not really apples to apples when you do a comparison between that and America doing it. It'd be more like if we compared it to Pennsylvania having a border policy. I don't even know how big Lithuania is. It might be even smaller than Pennsylvania. I'm not sure.
It's geographically slightly larger, but has only 2.7 million people. So it's like less than the Philadelphia area.
Sure. So, but you get my point. Like, we're talking about a much smaller region with much less people, and so like centrally planning for 300, whatever it is, 30 or 50 million people over what is like half a continent versus one small, state is a much different task, much different sort of machination. There's also this sort of
can I just say I'm not
sure, really quick on that.
Really quick on that though, that because the European Union and most countries in the European Union, including Switzerland, which is not in the EU, are part of what's called the Schengen zone, or the Schengen. They're signed on to the Schengen agreement. There is free migration between most countries in continental Europe, and so if you are admitted into Europe or if you get in illegally, then no one's going to stop you at the border from Italy into Switzerland, or Switzerland into Austria, Austria into Germany. And so it is sort of a sense, it's more like the United States now than Europe was 20 or 30 years ago. And so once you get in, you can kind of go anywhere, travel anywhere, but the question of where you can have benefits and rights and which state, which nation, which
Sure.
member
Yeah.
state is going to give you the best deal in terms of living situation and benefits. That is kind of like shopping around within the United States for
Yeah.
which state has most state level benefits.
I guess there's more potential there. Like right now, the way our governance is sort of practiced in America, if we've seen this happen in real time, like when Texas tried to enact their own border control, the federal government was like, "No, you don't have the right to do that." Whereas presumably the EU kind of those agreements are kind of like free to opt into and free to opt out of. Like at any point, any of these
It
countries
could opt out,
could opt out and start enforcing their own border the way they want to.
and they can be suspended in case of emergency, like with
Right.
COVID. So,
Yeah.
and because those borders were there in recent memory, it wasn't like, like you live close to Maryland and Pennsylvania border. There's roads that go back and forth across that straight line. There's no way you could enforce a border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, whereas you could between Lithuania and Poland, for example.
Right. So there's different facts on the ground there and different potentialities, but it's always going to be easier to have that potential to make more enforceable and intelligent sort of like immigration policies on a smaller scale. So there's the central planning problem there, and there's also this sort of disconnect, I think, where when we're doing these comparisons and we don't think about how, like, because some people use this term like anarcho tyranny, which I think is interesting, but I think it's more of like a black market effect. Like if you ban immigration, but then you are we're not even banning it. You're making it like there's a way to legally go through it, but it's like this long holdup, right? Then you're going to sort of then the people who care about following laws, the people like you who are like, well, like you went to another country, you knew what their laws were, and you're like, I'm going to abide by them. And there's presumably a lot of people from other countries who, if they came here, they want to do that, but they're not allowed instant access to come in and observe those laws. Now, the people who aren't going to wait in line and who just bypass that, even if we sort of select out all of the people who you and I would agree, there's definitely, especially during the Biden administration, there was a concerted effort to actually not just allow people to come here, but to intentionally import people here from halfway across the world who, didn't just happen to find themselves in Mexico crossing the border into America. Like it was, there was definitely a concerted effort there. But either way, when you crack down on legal immigration, you're going to get that black market of effect of then the only people who are coming here, you're kind of self-selecting for the people who care less about following rules and laws, even if even if I might not agree with those laws. It's like, but the type of person who is dispositionally more inclined to follow the laws are probably the people we'd want here more so than the people who go like whatever and just and don't care about that. So that's kind of an unintended consequence of all this. And the other thing is, like, I think Europe had this problem, and America's going to start facing this problem more too, is that when you don't have a just conception of how to do justice and how to define what is criminal activity, you're going to exacerbate these tensions too. More and more, we live in a nation that, kind of like ancient Israel did in the Old Testament, has kind of upended justice, and we sort of reward evil and punish good, right? It's funny, we have the world's biggest prison population, yet it's not mostly filled with murderers and thieves and rapists. It's mostly filled with nonviolent offenders, mostly for some kind of drug offense. And there are plenty of instances of, and it's sad, it's unfortunate, and like you can be as pro-immigration as you want and still recognize this is a problem, that there are people in Europe and America who have come here and committed violent crimes. But there's this stigma in our country about cracking down hard on these crimes against anyone who's not white already. And then if they're an immigrant, there's an even higher stigma placed around that. And so we see people with repeat offenses just being let out and not being convicted of crimes. And that exacerbates all the other things we've talked about too. And certainly it's not a biblical view, which I think this is kind of the weakness of the more left leaning or progressive or even libertine view on the immigration, where maybe they might have something I relate to more in terms of being more on the open side of things, but yet they still have a flawed view of criminality, and so they're kind of like, we're not pro chaos, right? Like
Yeah.
I host the Biblical Anarchy podcast, and I have to usually spend the first 20 minutes of any conversation where that word gets brought up explaining how that doesn't mean chaos and that
Anarchy
doesn't mean
doesn't mean what you think it means. Yeah.
right, exactly. But what the left, it is certainly true that the policies that the left is largely responsible for pushing here in America have created chaos in our immigration system. And so it's certainly like, if someone is looking at, our immigration system of the last 20 years and saying, I don't think that's right, I'm sympathetic to that. Like, I don't think that's right. It's not promoting the sort of like voluntary movement of people among normal market and voluntary signals and mechanisms that promote human flourishing. It's it's very unnatural on all levels, and there are mass influxes of people in ways that don't promote uh and again, we're generalizing here, painting with broad brushes, but
Mhm.
uh this does, I think, at root boil down to almost a confusion of the role of church and the role of state, and
Mhm.
or the role of civil governance, which, you know maybe I'm doing a meme here where the libertarian, boils things down to that, but I do think that at root that is kind of like, that is the equation that if we don't solve as the Western church, then all of these problems, uh, whether we're talking about what happens when pandemics happen, what we do about the movement of people, what we do about our currencies, what we do about war and conflicts between nations, none of these things are going to get any better until we
Mhm.
get that equation right.
Yeah. No, I think, and this is where, for me, as a pastor, you know, um, I'm a transitional pastor at a church in Erie, which is not a large city, but it's a city. And so it's kind of in Pennsylvania, like a pretty mixed politically place to be. Um, and I'm in a conservative but respectable conservative. What I mean is, sometimes I feel like we're a little too fearful of holding non-respectable positions. But people who have both compassion on immigrants and people who suffer for, have been dealt a rough hand in life, but then also people who are scared about um, violence and crime, and people who are just grieving when they see conflict and people shot in Minneapolis. Um, but this is the consequence, in a sense of, this is where I think where's the value added for a Christian and libertarian voice, is to say, look, local authority, this is predictable when you send people with guns to enforce laws, but then what if you had states and municipalities that were cooperating um, with ICE when they have someone who's already committed a violent crime? If they were to hand them over to ICE for deportation, which I think even people who, I say, people who are very hard line on immigration and want to see everyone who's here legally deported, and people who are, want to see more immigration, most people agree that violent illegal immigrants, people who've committed a violent crime, should be deported or should face some sort of punishment. They shouldn't just be let out. But then by refusing to let ICE deport those people, then it creates a situation where they have to go find them, apprehend them. They face resistance in the community, And so then these, as libertarians have been talking about police misconduct and unproductive interactions between police and citizens for a long time, these things will happen. And that's not to say anything specific about what happened to Alex Preddy or Renee Good in those situations. But this was going, if it wasn't them, it was going to be someone else. There was going to be something there. So
Yeah.
I think we have a situation where I do think that there's people who have good intentions, but they have then their compassion for foreigners has been, it is, as you say, a kind of a mistaken categories of the state and the church, or the civil magistrate and the church. So it doesn't, just because you can both support a civil magistrate keeping order in a jurisdiction, whatever that means, and also love the foreigner and the stranger who's in your midst and show them hospitality. Those two don't have to be in conflict. But until we sort that out, we're going to either harden our hearts towards people who are different from us, which is not what we should do biblically, or we're going to just tolerate anything that anyone does and say we have to protect the stranger.
Compassion and love for your neighbor and like compassion and love for your neighbor and for foreigners can't become lawlessness, and yet we can't substitute proper order with tyranny just because we don't want chaos, because tyranny just breeds more chaos, right? That I think we're kind of seeing that play, like this whole situation with the shootings that happened with ICE. It's one of those things that's really tough to judge, because it just feels like both sides are kind of like they've lost their minds, and I don't know how to like properly weigh in on it, because on one hand, like I'm watching ICE agents just completely mishandle situations and use violent means that aren't warranted, and I think a lot of these people are untrained, and they're entering situations I don't think that they should be entering, that they're not prepared for.
Yeah,
But there's
and they're held to a higher standard than citizens too, because they wield the sword.
Exactly.
So, regardless of how disrespectfully you're treated, regardless of what if you're an agent of the state, you're held to a higher standard, because
100%. And yet it's also like no one. It's like I agree with you. Yeah, I also would like. I guess the little bit of not really pushback, but like the wrinkle there is that you should be held to a higher standard, but nothing magical happens when you wear that badge that gives you superhuman restraint to deal with what is actually like. I don't excuse the leftist agitators and protesters who are acting like who are not protesting tyranny in a way that I think is like above reproach, right? Which I think as Christians, what we're called to do. We can oppose tyranny and engage in civil protest in a way that doesn't invite criticism on us, that doesn't make us easy targets. And like I don't excuse police brutality, but it's also like they're just human. No, like no amount of training can override the human condition, and like someone spits in your face or things happen that are bang bang and you don't know if someone has a weapon, you're going to fear for your life. And what are you going to do in that situation? And it's like it's a no-win situation as far as I'm concerned. And there's jump in there. Yeah.
Well, and if you care about, so let's say you're a person of the left, or someone who's more interested in more immigration, like I am, and I do think that there's something we have sort of a higher burden of proof, because it's more of an innate human reaction to be suspicious of foreigners and of immigrants. I think I mentioned Brian Kaplan. He talks about this in The Myth of the Rational Voter. I do think it is true that there is a natural cognitive bias to be suspicious of foreigners. So if we, as let's say, as libertarians, or as Christians, or as just people who are more progressive, if we think that it's objectively a good thing that America should accept more immigration or that there should be more openness to immigrants, then this is a really bad way to get people on your side, because you are defending the least sympathetic immigrants, and you're putting yourself in a way of you're obstructing law enforcement trying to supposedly apprehend the worst representatives of your cause, and then you're not going to get people on your side. So
Yeah.
the better way to, like you said, there would be better ways to protest, and just like, yeah, there's a higher burden on those of us who would be making the case for more immigration and for a more sensible policy that allows more people to come here legally.
Yeah, I think
This isn't helping.
it's not helping. And yet the conservatives are not helping when they want to act like the crisis allows them to find exceptions to due process, when they want to then once again become hypocrites on the Second Amendment, which just also irritates me. And it's just, yeah, it's just like, it's a lot of kind of I like that Family Guy meme where it's just like the parent, and he's got like a kid on either side who are just fighting, and he stops them with the kids. He's like, you're both awful. And that's kind of how I feel watching this situation unfold, because I'm just like, I don't know who to support in all this. It's like, I don't support the ICE agents and conservatives who are like not just targeting. They're trying to target some of the violent offenders, but they're not doing a good job of that. They're not using due process. They're detaining a lot of people for years, sometimes months at a time, without due process, putting them God knows where. Sometimes if they don't get
shipping them to countries, not even the countries that they're from.
Right, and
like,
that's
let's have a personal prison in El Salvador or wherever. Like,
and then there's just other. I mean, and this is the bicentennial year of America's founding, and the
semi-quincentennial,
something like that. Yeah, and the this country was founded by armed people using their God-given rights to resist tyranny, which meant like confronting armed agents of the states. I'm trying to phrase this carefully for YouTube, right? I'm not calling for that right now. But when conservatives, and listen, I'm not that sympathetic to the leftist agitators, but when conservatives start saying you don't have a right to resist police officers enforcing the law, I just go, hold on. Like, what do you mean by the law? Just whatever the government passes? Because that's not a Christian view of governance at all. Like, that's not a defensible position, and it's also not defensible on just like even if you're not a Christian, like if you're gonna invoke the Constitution and America, then like, what are you saying? The American Revolution was unjustified because they were you have to have a more sophisticated. Now, I'm also not saying that anytime you don't like a law, take to the streets and engage in armed conflict with the police or with like, these things are actually complicated, right? And anyone who's trying to reduce it to like sloganeering and just kind of taking shots at the other side, and who is too casually either making generalizations about immigrants or wanting to sweep away restrictions that should be placed on both people and on government. It's like everyone's just losing their minds about it, and it's I am interested, like, how do you address that? Like, how should pastors try to address that? Because I'm very sympathetic to like my pastor, because like I know there's many churches like this. Our congregation's rather split. Like, we're an evangelical Reformed American church here in kind of the I guess northern part of the, kind of still considered part of the Bible Belt, but like, we have diehard MAGA Trump voting Republicans, and we have never Trumpers and Democratic voters, and a bunch of independents and people in the middle who are kind of like all over the place. And like, I never want to put pastors in a position where it's like, you have to do what I do and you need to focus on politics. But it's also kind of like, when stuff like this is happening, you can't just like not chime in on it and give any sort of pastoral guidance for people. So like how do you approach things like this? This will kind of like, you can take as long as you need. Like what's your kind of closing, sort of like, pastoral thoughts for like how to try to, as individuals, as those who are elders and servants in their local communities, how do we uh pursue truth and unity on this in a way that doesn't invoking your book's title, that doesn't divide us anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, it's obviously it's a challenge. I would say that, taking it from the level of, arguing policy, which we have been, which as citizens we have a right to do, but to the level of, the individual Christian or the individual church community. I think part of this, part of what is what makes these things so hot and so divisive is that everything's globalized now. So Adam Smith has this very lovely bit in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a very interesting book that most people don't read. If they read something by Adam Smith, it's usually The Wealth of Nations, or An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or whatever the long title is. But Theory of Moral Sentiments, he uses this analogy where if you have the average, normal, empathetic human got news of an earthquake on the other side of the world that had killed 1 million people, he would feel bad. But then I have the quotation here. He says that this man would express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. And then Smith says that this man, having heard about 1 million people killed, would eventually go about his day and sleep fine that night. But if this same man knew for some reason that his little finger was going to be amputated the next day without anesthetic, he would not sleep at all that night. And the story, his analogy is this, that we tend to care more about things. It's natural to care about things that are closer to us and that we actually can do something about and that can affect us. And the downside of living in this globalized news environment that we are is that we can see all of the outrages and all the injustices and all of these awful things all over the world. We're bombarded with them. And also our politics has become more nationalized and internationalized than I think it ever has been. And so it's like, well, why should I in Pennsylvania care so much about what's happening in Minnesota? Well, maybe it will eventually affect me, or I feel like it will eventually affect me. So I think stepping into, acknowledging those challenges of our present situation as Christians in 21st century, I'm still in the 20th century, 21st century America. I think we need to weep with those who weep. It is appropriate for us to always remember that these are people that we're dealing with here, right? Even if we decide that for whatever reason our country can't accept these immigrants or can't help these foreigners, or our church just can't help everyone, we still, I think, should weep with those who suffer. And that is something that places us close to the heart of God, because God sees human suffering and weeps, whatever the cause, whether it's self-induced or induced by others, or the brokenness of the world. So I think continuing to empathize with people in the way that God does is important for our character and to keep us from becoming hard-hearted. The second thing I think we need to do is always recognize that we can help some people, and we can help those whom God brings across our path. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, which Jesus told to illumine the question of, well, who is my neighbor? If I should love my neighbor, who is my neighbor? Well, the Samaritan is my neighbor, but the Samaritan loved the Jewish man who he found on the side of the road, and he was the man that he found on the side of the road. He didn't have to go somewhere else to find him. He was the one that he came across. So he loved that man that he came across and took care of him. And so, insofar as it depends on us in our day-to-day lives and in where we live, we should love our neighbors. And sometimes that includes my enemy is my neighbor, right? And then I do think there is something that's important about organizing with others proactively to help others, not just within our tribe, but even if it's in a symbolic way or even in a small way, to have your church or your community be active in helping people who are explicitly different from you, whether that's supporting missionaries or humanitarian work overseas or in a different part of the culture, if you or of our country. If you're in a rural area, maybe doing urban missions. If you're in an urban area, someplace that's more in Appalachia, it's underprivileged in some fashion, but seeking proactively to serve those who are different from you in the ways that you can. I'm not talking about government. This is really where there's, as we know as libertarians, there's a lot of ways that government crowds out the love and charity of human beings and private charity and churches and civic organizations. So let's not let government crowd us out in that regard. And if we do these three things, if we maintain a proper empathy that is keeping with the character of God, if we help those who come across our path, and then organize in different ways to help those who are different from us in ways that actually are genuinely helpful, then I think that we will vote better, we will speak better, we will be prepared to share the gospel with people who are different from us and who are from our tribe as well, whatever that means. And so because we will be becoming more Christ-like in our attitudes. And I think that that's really the answer, right? It's not that liberty for its own sake is the hope of nations. It's that Christ is the hope of nations.
Yes.
And individuals. And liberty is the context in which we are able to live the lives that God has appointed for us to live. But liberty for its own sake, it's not just for its own sake.
I agree with that. I wanted to close by what you were saying there lined up with, I was thinking about our church has this, we call it like our little mission wheel, which I have on I don't think you can really see it on my phone here. It's not showing up, but it's sort of, it's labeled the gospel of Christ at the center. And then it has like these 4 quadrants in the wheel, and they kind of lead into each other like in a circle. And it's like, it starts with experiencing God, embracing truth, which leads into establishing community and engaging the world. And I think that if we are, truly understanding the gospel, and we're truly experiencing that transformative power of the gospel in our individual lives, and we're trying to embrace the truth of what Scripture teaches us, then when we go out into the world, when we go to establish community and to, engage the world around us, we need to be praying to view people in the same way, like with the same heart and the eyes that the Father views us. And on the thumbnail for this episode, I saw I included a animated version of these protest signs I've seen around, which again, I think sometimes are held by more progressive Christians, and they probably are bringing some baggage into this that I don't want to associate with. But the phrase itself, I think, is a powerful one, which is just asking, who would Jesus support? And I think that's just, I always want to, this is, I think, first and foremost a libertarian critique, but I've kind of co-opted it to it's like combining it with what I was raised with, the what would Jesus do kind of sloganeering from the 90s. And it's like, at the end of the day, if politicians are just people, police are just people, we as voters, we're voting for what government does, but what government does is people doing things. Then it's like, if we're imagining that what we're doing is being watched by Jesus, by our King, then it's like, imagine yourself explaining to Jesus what you're about to do and why you have to do it. At the end of the day, if you're saying what I need to do is justify to Jesus sending these armed men into this apartment building and threatening violence against this group of people because of it's like, what's leading your heart at that moment? Are you being led by the gospel? Are you being led by trying to serve Christ and to serve his kingdom? Or are you being led by fear and by other things? And now, extrapolating that into policy and whatnot, I get is something that I'm very careful to not overstate. I'm not saying if you're not a full-fledged Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist tomorrow that you're a bad Christian. I actually think that it's more about, I think there's a lot of Christians who do genuinely want to follow Christ. And I think what both of us are trying to say, different angles here, but the same message is just try to do that and apply it consistently across the board. Let's approach these discussions about policy from that same foundation. If we want this to be a Christian nation, that has to start with us as Christians living as Christians, doing those 4 things I just talked about in a way that honors Christ. And so that's I guess the message I want to put out there. I appreciate you being here, Benj. Of course, we'll again plug your book, A House Divided. People can go to, I think it's still up, housedividedbook.com if they want to find that. Is there anything else you wanted to plug or closing remarks before we hop off?
Well, yeah, I actually, now that you mention it, so behind me, I could see over here is A House Divided. They're standing there. But I also last year happened to, like Cody, publish 2 books. And this one is up here. It's called My Salvation is Close at Hand, Isaiah 56 to 66 for the Church After Christendom. And in this book, it seems like these wouldn't be related at all, but I feel like there is some overlap in terms of using Isaiah 56 to 66 to explore or bring out of Isaiah 56 to 66 truths about who we are as Christians and what we are called to that are applicable in a church context, in a social context after Christendom, where we live sort of, or at least in a declining Christendom. And I do have a section in the conclusion about what does it mean? What should we as Christians be thinking in terms of our relation to those outside of the United States, the nations? Are we? I think there's some provocative or evocative and helpful ways of thinking about how do we apply Scripture in a modern context, especially with respect to immigration and welcoming of immigrants, and then also gospel and empire, and whether considering whether the role of the United States, have we become sort of, are we Assyria now? Is it right for us to think of ourselves as Israel, as the city on a hill, or are American Christians called to think of ourselves as a remnant within the exile of Assyria or Babylon? So if you got salvation close at hand, My Salvation is Close at Hand, salvationcloseathandbook.com, or housedividedbook.com, where you can just search for Benjamin Giffone and you'll find both those books. So I do kind of see them as it's appropriate that they came out within a month of each other. So
well, I haven't checked out the second book yet, so I'll have to do that. But yeah, again, I really appreciate your writings and your insight. I think it's really important that we, again, just to gush a little bit more on A House Divided, the book I have read, just recapturing what it means to be the church, what it means to do church. All this talk about, we talked a lot about culture and setting things right, and I think it kind of starts there. Reclaiming what it means to do church and the importance of church, and Yeah. So I mean, I say that as a low church Reformed Baptist, but still agree with the message.
Okay. Everywhere I say sacraments in there, I also say ordinances. So
Right.
to
Yeah.
make you Baptist folk happy.
Yes, you're very very ecumenical that way. But yeah, awesome. Thank you, Benj, for doing this. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. You can of course find all of our episodes, all of our podcasts by going to christiansforliberty.net. Here in the green room, if you want to catch us live, we're live here every Monday night. I'll be back here again next Monday. Every second Monday, I'm doing a crossover green room with the Liberty Dad podcast. That's DL Cummins. And then two other guys, Adam Coleman and Tyler Yankee. We're all libertarians, not all of us Christians, but we get together and we talk about fatherhood and parenting and things related to that. So pretty new series that we started, but very excited for it. A lot of fun. Looking into the overlap with all this and parenting and whatnot, I think is very crucial as well. So that'll be next Monday. That should be at 8 o'clock Eastern time. If I have that correctly. Make sure you follow us on our socials, me at Biblical Anarchy, and of course at LCI Official for the Libertarian Christian Institute. On X is where we're the most active, but also on Facebook and Instagram and other socials as well. That's all I have for you guys for tonight. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ, take care.